Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Ron Klatz for the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine. On today's episode of Immortality Now, we have Dr. Malcom Kendrick, and he's a very interesting individual with very iconoclastic views that I feel are mostly correct. And you have an opportunity to learn for yourself. Carol, my co-host, Carol Peterson, a famous compounding pharmacist, an expert in hormone replacement therapy. My co-host is here to join us. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ron. And thank you, Dr. Kendrick, for joining us. I give a little background, but what really provoked this was coming across your book, The Clot Thickens, and totally about how plaque starts with the formation of thrombi. But you had taken other tactics with this. You wrote The Great Cholesterol Con. You wrote about the data that are presented in medical literature. It's fraudulent or skewed, and how to be a better reader of that literature. You are a member of a group of cholesterol theory skeptics called Thinks. And then I think this is absolutely lovely, and it's a great credential. You've been wiped out off of Wikipedia. So I don't know how you get on Wikipedia in the first place, but you triggered something in somebody that they wiped you out. So Dr. Kendrick comes to us from England. And Dr. Kendrick, could you give us a little background about yourself and how you came to have such an inquiring mind and how it brought you to the book, The Clot Thickens?
Well, thank you. Although I'm living in England, I am a Scotsman, so I'm surrounded by Sassenachs, unfortunately. How did I come to be so, or how I have a questioning mind? I don't really know. I sometimes tell people my father was a very bright and iconoclastic man himself, and he actually designed nuclear submarines and things like that. So he's quite a bright guy. But I was doing mathematics, which is not my greatest strength. I struggle with it. But he was reading one of the textbooks I was struggling with, and he looked at one page and he ripped it out. He said, "Well, that's complete rubbish for starters." At which point I thought, "Oh, that's interesting." Reading books is true, you know. So maybe I got it from there somewhat. I think it's just I just like to always try and get down to the core of a thing, which and if I can't understand it, well, that's probably sometimes because I just can't understand it. But sometimes I just think, I'm not getting this, I'm not getting it. What are you talking about? So when it came to heart disease, when I was at medical school in a long time ago, Scotland had the highest rate of heart disease in the world. Well, it probably did. You come to realize after a while that statistics are sometimes not entirely reliable, but it was very much up there. And we were taught the usual stuff at medical school. It's a terrible Scots diet. That raises your cholesterol level, and that thickens up your arteries, and then you die of coronary heart disease, and that's that. But I happened to go to France quite a few times. One thing I noticed in France was they sure as hell didn't hang back on eating saturated fat. You know, pâté de foie gras, you know, they slathered everything in butter and whatever. So I started looking at the statistics, and I found, not surprising to me, that the French ate more saturated fat than the Scots. The cholesterol level was pretty much the same. And if you looked at all the other risk factors for heart disease, smoking, obesity, blood pressure, the usual standard ones that aren't necessarily terribly important, but we'll not go into that. You couldn't really put I would say, a cigarette paper between them. No one has cigarette papers anymore. But anyway, if you did, the French should have been dying from heart disease at a higher rate than the Scots, because their risk factors were a bit worse. They definitely smoked more, for example. And yet their risk of heart disease was 5 times higher than it was in Scotland, age matched, so men up to the age of 65 or whatever. And French men had half the rate of heart disease as Scottish women, for example, and women are supposed to be protected against heart disease by their hormones and such like. So I started thinking, well, this doesn't fit, does it? It doesn't work. I still believed in the cholesterol hypothesis at that time, but I thought, well, the diet bit sounds like rubbish. And that's why I ended up writing The Clot Thickens, which is, okay, the cholesterol hypothesis is bunk. If you look at it for 10 seconds and you've got a brain, you realize it's bunk. So what the hell is it? It must be something. What is it? And that's what I've spent 35 years of my life battling away with, until eventually I thought, I think I do know what causes it. Of course, at that point, I found that I was not the first person to have ever thought this. Over the years, starting in 1850, people have thought this. But it's like a ghost in the machine. If you've ever heard of the concept of a ghost in the machine. It's been there, it's been around, people have talked about it, but it's just never somehow managed to grab the attention of the scientific world or people or anything, really.
So you've built that book on all this research that's out there, as you say, and I like that you used a fundamental booklet put out by who's now Pfizer, right? Who didn't pay attention to their original research, just jumped in to buy the rights to Lipitor and made it the biggest selling statin ever. And I'm so concerned in the US, we've even developed this medical specialty. We have lipidemiologists or something like that, who supposedly know everything about every little fraction about cholesterol. And there is such a push to get everybody on statin drugs to drop our cholesterol, leaving us unable to make hormones, for one thing, unable to repair our cells. So we become medical cripples. I have personal experience of one of my friends who pretty much died, and on autopsy, she was diagnosed with ALS. About a year later, there was a medical article, the formation of this ALS disease caused by the statins. And I can't believe how many women, if you're a woman and you go to a doctor in the US and you're menopausal age, they want to plop the statin on you. It's horrific. Yet you made such a good argument for the generation of thrombi creating this. So could you go through some of the stuff? I love what you say about as we age, we're aging and we've got things like damage to our glycocalyx, and if you could go in that, and not enough. And
hold on a second, Carol. I'm on the edge of my seat here, because we've already talked about the good doctor has told us what's not causing heart disease. Now
we want to know.
I want to know exactly what is causing heart disease.
Well, obviously it's a top secret and I can't let anybody know. I'll have to kill them.
Well, that's between the three of us.
Okay. Don't tell
the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine.
Don't tell anybody. Don't tell anyone.
Okay.
Well, in the end, you start at the end, if you like, which is we know, and it's widely accepted that the final event in cardiovascular disease is always a blood clot forms somewhere. If it forms in your neck, it travels up into your brain and causes a stroke. I mean, you can have a burst blood vessel in your brain, but that's usually secondary to an area where there previously looked like there had been a clot, it got stuck. So there was some thinning and damage to that artery, not always. And if you have a heart attack, obviously a clot forms in one of your coronary arteries and blocks the blood supply, and that causes a myocardial infarction. And you can get blood clots anywhere in the body. You can get them in your kidneys and your liver and whatever, but generally the ones that kill people are heart and brain, and they're the ones that most people have heard of. So everyone and the medical world itself says, well, yes, that's the final event, all right? And if you move a step back, you say, well, what happens if blood clots form and they don't kill you? So you have a blood clot that half blocks an artery or blocks it and then opens. because we know this happens quite a lot. We know that you can find people who've had heart attacks. The enzymes have gone up, there's damage to the myocardial muscle, and yet you can't find a blood clot. It seems to have gone. All right. So you're saying, well, there must be times when blood clots form and go. And there was a study looking at the progression of what they call atherosclerosis, thickening of the arteries, where people who had had heart disease were exposed to, well, they had scans every year. And what they did not see was that the arterial plaque gradually grew in the artery, got narrower and narrower and narrower. What you saw is that in general, there were jumps. So you look at it one year and there wouldn't be a narrowing, and the next year there would. And this was not what they call, this was sudden. There were sudden events. So it looked like, and it does look like, a blood clot is forming, not fully blocking the artery, or maybe fully blocking the artery, but then being cleared away. And then where that blood clot has formed and stuck, that's where the plaque grows. Now, again, that's widely accepted by the medical profession. So we know that the plaques can grow through a clot forming on an area where there's previously been a plaque or atherosclerosis. We know it's the final event. So it doesn't seem like a gigantic leap to say, well, maybe that's what happens in the first place. Maybe that's what starts it off. It's the same process from start to finish.
If that's the case, doctor, then wouldn't simply taking additional enzymes block most heart disease?
No, because you die of other things, generally. I mean, aspirin, of course, stops clots forming, and it does reduce the risk of heart disease to an extent. People who've had heart disease are put on anticoagulants. People who've got blood clots are put on anticoagulants, yes. And you can use enzymes. Enzymes are used to clear. If you use the common enzyme used to clear a blocked heart blood vessel, coronary artery, is called tissue plasminogen activator. And tissue plasminogen activator goes to the clot. It locks onto a protein called plasminogen. It converts plasminogen to plasmin, and plasmin slices fibrin apart, and fibrin are the sticky protein strands that hold the clot together. So before stenting and whatever came along, if you're having a heart attack, people would give you an enzyme, TPA, tissue plasminogen activator, that would bust the clot apart and the heart blood vessel would open up again. So yes, it can be used acutely, and yes, they do use anticoagulants to prevent heart disease. So you've got other, beyond aspirin, you've got things like clopidogrel and Tegric, or whatever it's called, which are designed to stop platelets sticking together. And platelets are, although it's a very complicated system, blood clots are basically made up of platelets and fibrin. If there's damage to a blood vessel, the first thing that happens is platelets, which are billions of them floating around your bloodstream, are attached to the area. They hurl themselves at the damaged area. They form a kind of block or a dam to stop blood escaping, and then fibrin comes along and wraps around the platelets, and you end up with a thick, but a very difficult to remove clot. And that's all the clotting factors are designed essentially to achieve this. So, if you cut yourself or scrape your skin, obviously you start bleeding, and then it will stop bleeding, and then you develop a scab on your skin. They call it a scab in America, I presume. And then that scab is very hard, it's very solid, and it will fall off eventually, fall to the ground. Well, obviously, if a scab forms inside one of your arteries, it cannot break off, because if it did, it would just travel further down the artery and get blocked somewhere else. So if a blood clot forms within a blood vessel, it has to be got rid of, and that getting rid of has to involve not allowing it to break off and travel down your body, because one of the common places to get clots is in your neck and carotid arteries. And we do know that they very often, if they get big and they get what they call friable or breakable offable, they do break off, they travel into the brain and you have a stroke. So this is something that the body has to not allow to happen. So the process being, essentially, is you damage the lining of an artery, generally arteries, because that's where the blood flow and the biomechanical stress is greatest. It may be a small area, but that triggers blood clotting at a very high rate, because lying underneath the lining of your blood vessels, within the cells underneath, is a thing called tissue factor. Tissue factor is like, just fires the blood clot into action. It overrides all of the other clotting systems and says, clot here, now, at this point. The platelets are attracted, all sorts of other things are attracted, red blood cells, everything gets clumped in, and then you get a blood clot at that point. Now, clearly, if it kept growing and growing and growing, it would block the artery completely, and you'd have a heart attack or a stroke or whatever. So that at the same time as it's growing, it's being told to stop growing. So for every pro-clotting factor, there's an anti-clotting factor. And if there's 30 pro-clotting factors, there's 30 anti-clotting factors. In fact, there's probably many more than that. Every time I open up something, I find there's another clotting factor that I've never even heard of. But anyway, it's really, really complicated, but in one way, but very simple in the other. So you've damaged the artery wall, the blood clot is formed on the artery wall, and now you've got to get rid of it. And this is where, you know, when the original ideas were coming along, they'd never heard of endothelial progenitor cells. They didn't know they existed. They didn't know the glycocalyx existed. You know, they didn't know hardly anything, and yet they had a hypothesis that they knew was true. Anyway, so you've got a blood clot and it's stuck to the side of your artery wall. What are you going to do with it? Well, you can shave it down, and you do shave it down. So the TPA activates the fibrin destruction, but it's held very tight onto the artery wall, because that point obviously shall not be broken down, because otherwise you would just expose the area of damage again. So you get clot, 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 clot. Well, that doesn't happen, because that would be mad. So what happens is, the area that's got the clot on, there are things called endothelial progenitor cells. They're made in the bone marrow. They float around in the bloodstream. Once they see an area of damage, they stick to that area of damage. They grow, and they form a new endothelial layer that sits now on top of the blood clot. And that blood clot has been effectively drawn into the artery wall, at which point it is now called a plaque. Now, 99.999% of the time, that blood clot will then be broken down by white blood cells, macrophages, and all the systems, and it will be gone. You won't even see that it has been there. However, if you keep having problems at the same point, the repair systems start to be unable to clear it away fully. So it starts to grow. And when you look at plaques and you cut them that open, you find that about 40% of them show layers like tree rings, where there is clearly been an event, followed by 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 an event. And the only explanation for that is that blood clots have formed on that same point repeatedly. The plaque has therefore grown, and it becomes, eventually narrows the artery and becomes the focus for the final disastrous big blood clot. It doesn't have to be much bigger, but the artery will be that much thinner at that point. And essentially, that's the process of how plaques start, how they grow, and how eventually, if they get big enough, they will kill you.
And so how do we interrupt this process so that we can enjoy the benefits of longevity?
Yes.
And to get to those, those august years of a century and beyond.
Yes. Well, absolutely. I mean, there's no point in having a hypothesis if you can't say, well, what you're going to do about it. Well, obviously, it brings together a lot of things, because what you're going to say is, well, what are the things that can damage the artery wall, the endothelial cells, and sitting on top of the endothelial cells, by the way, there's a little forest called the glycocalyx. Mm-hmm. Now, if you asked 100 doctors, I'll guarantee 99 of them, possibly 100, have never heard of the glycocalyx, but it's absolutely critical to the story, because the glycocalyx is a bit like, well, you know, if you try and pick up a fish, it slips through your fingers. It's very difficult to hold, unless it's a shark, but that's a different matter. Anyway, the reason why you can't hold the fish is because it's covered in glycocalyx, and this glycocalyx is incredibly slippery. It's the slipperiest substance known to man. And your arteries and all your blood vessels are covered in glycocalyx, like a little forest, glycoproteins. So it's glucose plus proteins. Different proteins are attached to the strands. This stuff allows everything to flow past the endothelial cells without damaging them. It allows red blood cells to go through capillaries, because capillaries are slightly narrower than a single red blood cell. And without this slipperiness, the red blood cells couldn't go through. It's utterly critical. And so you want to protect your glycocalyx. And things that damage your glycocalyx, one thing that's absolutely known to damage your glycocalyx is a high blood sugar level. The glycocalyx strips the glycocalyx from blood vessels or thins it right down. So definitely high blood sugar levels are bad, i.e. diabetes is bad, as we all know. But why is it bad? So if you look at smoking and say, well, what's smoking doing? Well, smoking, how does that cause heart disease? Well, the answer is that when you smoke, nanoparticles are released from the cigarette smoke. These nanoparticles are small enough to travel straight through the lungs and into the bloodstream, and you can measure this happening. When they arrive at the endothelium and the glycocalyx, they start killing off endothelial cells, and you can measure this because there's a thing called microparticles, which are released when endothelial cells die. And healthy volunteers were told to smoke 1 cigarette. You can measure microparticles go up very, very rapidly. So you're killing endothelial cells. At the same time, the bone marrow is stimulated to produce endothelial progenitor cells. So the endothelial progenitor cells say damage is occurring, they rush out, cover over these areas of damage, and basically you've got a kind of balance going on. So if you smoke, then you can get away with smoking if the repair systems are working well. But if the repair systems start to stutter, then as you get older, for instance, then smoking becomes more and more of a problem because the repair systems are not working. And so when COVID-19 came along, I actually was writing a chapter about vasculitis, which is vasculitis just being inflammation of the vascular system. And looking at why certain viruses cause a vasculitis and then increase the risk of heart disease, which has been well known for many years, because influenza A and B, they also attack the endothelial cells, they damage them, and then you get blood clotting. And so you're more likely to get heart attacks or strokes following influenza for some period of time afterwards. So when you looked at the COVID-19 virus, it specifically attacks cells with A2 receptors, and A2 receptors are found in vascular cells, also kidney cells and lung cells as well. So the COVID virus attaches itself to endothelial cells, gains entry, starts to multiply itself within endothelial cells. Then the immune system comes along and says, we don't like cells that have got viruses in them, and it attacks them and it kills them. And as it does so, it causes blood clotting all around the body, which is why COVID-19, and some would say why you'd have to be careful with spike proteins, because when spike proteins attach themselves or start coming out of cells, then the body will attack them as it would a cell infected with a viral particle and will kill them. And this can happen in cells that express A2. So anyway, so you've got smoking, you've got diabetes, you've got COVID-19. You say, well, what are the other, what other major causes are there? So I went off to the extremes and said, what disease is associated with the highest rate of cardiovascular disease and death in the world? And the answer to that is sickle cell anemia. You're going to say, well, where does that fit into this pattern? Well, the answer is sickled cells are sharp and pointy. And as they charge around the body being sharp and pointy, they damage and destroy endothelial cells in the glycocalyx. And in fact, before they came along with blood transfusions, sickled children died aged about 2 or 3. But once they stopped them dying of age about 2 or 3, what they found was that the commonest cause of death was then cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis. I was looking at a very sad case of a 12-year-old boy who was admitted to hospital with a gangrenous foot. And the reason why he had a gangrenous foot was because his blood vessels in his leg were so badly narrowed and atherosclerotic that the blood flow was so badly compromised. He lost his foot. He had a stroke. When they analyzed him, every single artery in his body was full of calcified atherosclerosis, aged 12. And his brother died of a stroke. So if you look and say, what are the things that trigger a high risk of cardiovascular disease? What you say is there are things that can damage the endothelium. or the glycocalyx, or both. And when you start looking at the true causes, because the other disease, by the way, the increased risk of cardiovascular disease in sickle cell is 50,000 times higher.
Wow.
Sorry, 50,000%.
Wow.
And if you look at the other disease, which is in the extreme of causing cardiovascular disease, is systemic lupus erythematosus. And SLE is an autoimmune disease, and it's an autoimmune disease that is often associated with a thing called antiphospholipid syndrome. And you may or may not have heard of antiphospholipid syndrome, but obviously all your cell membranes are made of phospholipids. So if you have antiphospholipid syndrome, it means that your body has decided it doesn't like phospholipids, it's going to attack and destroy them, which sounds a bit disastrous, and in fact it is. There is a disease, a one-off called antiphospholipid disease, also called Hughes disease, which is where the body starts attacking the endothelial cells. And these people get strokes when they're 20. They get, I think, 0.5% of people in the population has antiphospholipid syndrome, but it is reckoned to cause 50% of strokes of people under the age of 50. So 1 in 2 strokes in younger people is due to antiphospholipid syndrome.
So what do we do to repair the vessels and raise and repair the glycocalyx?
Well, what you do is, one of the things you can do, there are certain proteins that you can take. They are part of the glycocalyx. Chondroitin sulfate, for instance. In fact, there was a study, really fascinating study on chondroitin sulfate, which never looked as though it could possibly do any good, or no one can understand how it could do any good. And they found that, well, people take it if they got arthritis, and it helps with arthritic problems and cartilage damage, because cartilages are made of various proteins. What they found was a really significant reduction in cardiovascular disease when people taking chondroitin sulfate. And no one would believe this because they couldn't understand how this could possibly be the case. The other things you can do, one of the most important things is the most critical compound in your body for repairing and sustaining your endothelial cells is nitric oxide. Nitric oxide stimulates the production of new endothelial progenitor cells. It strengthens, in fact, nitric oxide is produced within the glycocalyx itself. That's where it's made. And if you look at there's been some very fascinating research done on Viagra, because Viagra has the effect of increasing nitric oxide synthesis, not just in the penis, but also all the other blood vessels in your body. And someone just pointed me at a study yesterday showing that men who had erectile dysfunction who took Viagra had a reduction in the rate of heart disease and stroke of about 25 to 30%. And it also reduced the risk of Alzheimer's by about 75%, I think, was what they found. So nitric oxide, yeah, there's a couple of things that will give you good synthesis of nitric oxide. One is sunshine on the skin increases nitric oxide production, and this reduces blood pressure and restores function of your cardiovascular system. So going outside and being outside and walking outside in the sun is probably just about the single most beneficial thing that you can do. And so these are things we're obviously told not to do, and put on sunscreen and all this rubbish, which is just rubbish. Exercise increases nitric oxide synthesis.
This is fascinating. We need about 3 more hours to do it, but we're coming up on the end. And I don't want it to end. We're gonna have to do another interview. But coming up on the end, could you share with us your thoughts on what listeners can do to protect themselves from cardiovascular disease? Now, you've already told us about sunshine, walking outside, increasing nitric oxide, which I imagine includes not just Viagra, but beets as well. What other advice would you have for your listeners?
Well, I think it comes down to trying to work out what your cause of your endothelial damage might be. Now, that's why it's very difficult to give an absolutely straight. There are certain generic things that everybody can do. Don't be stressed, because psychological and high levels of physical stress have an impact on raising various hormones such as cortisol that actually reduce nitric oxide synthesis and make your blood more likely to clot. So it's not just the endothelial damage, it's also, is your blood hypercoagulable at the same time? And so you have to be concerned about that. Now, I would say, what's the other single most important thing that you can do is, well, ironically, of course, statins have one effect that I like about them, which is that they increase nitric oxide synthesis in the endothelium, which is slightly frustrating because I don't want anyone to take statins, but they do. The other thing is, obviously, you want to keep your blood sugar level down and keep it down. So if you've got a high blood sugar level, you want to stop eating carbohydrates as much as possible and start eating fats instead. Saturated fats are particularly good, but obviously losing weight. And the other one thing that I am a bit keen on, maybe other people are less, is short burst high intensity exercise.
You say saturated fats are particularly good.
Yes.
Well, that kind of against the narrative, doesn't it?
Yes, but it happens to be a fact that the saturated fats are the fats we are designed to eat by nature. We are not designed to eat polyunsaturated fats. They cause problems within the cell membranes because our cell membranes are not really sure what to do with these bloody things. And essentially, this is, I'll give you just one final example. France is the highest saturated fat consumption in Europe and has the lowest rate of cardiovascular disease in Europe. And prior to the war, Ukraine had the lowest intake of saturated fats in Europe and had the highest rate of heart attacks and cardiovascular disease in Europe, which of course there are other factors going on. But if you look at the top 5 saturated fat consuming countries in Europe versus the lowest 5 saturated fat consuming countries in Europe, the average difference is that the higher saturated fat consumption countries, France, Spain, Italy, Switzerland, etc., have 1/6 of the rate of heart disease of the countries with the lowest rate of saturated fat consumption, which you would think would be enough to convince people that saturated fats at the very worst cannot be doing you any harm, and at the best might be doing you quite a lot of good.
Wow. This is fascinating stuff. I agree with almost all of it. And I want to thank you so much for your work with your books, your research, for coming on Immortality Now, for the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine. God bless and be well, and we're going to get you back again, because I know there's a whole lot more that you have to say about not just cardiovascular disease, but neurological disease and cancer and probably a bunch of other things that need to be, the narrative has to be busted if we're going to achieve our potential for health and long life.
Well, I absolutely agree.
With our audience, Dr. Kendrick?
Sorry?
Is there any last thought you want to share with our audience?
Think for yourselves.
That's hard to do.
And do you want to give us your website so people can find you?
Yeah, I've got a blog. It's on WordPress. It's drmalcolmkendrick.org, where you can also buy my books and buy hundreds of copies for yourself and your friends. And yeah, we live in funny times.
Well, your book, The Clot Thickens, is an excellent read. Not only is it sound, and in references in science and thinking, it's written with a delightful sense of humor. So it makes the process so wonderful. So thank you, Dr. Kendrick, for joining us today.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Dr. Kendrick, for the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine. Live long and well. And you can find out everything you want to know about the Academy at www.worldhealth.net.